I'm Merysa. I'm Merysa, and this is Lucy. Welcome to Deep Thought.
Hello. We home educate, and one of the things that we like to do is talk about a subject and debate a subject, not necessarily finding an answer, but we like to just talk around a subject and see where it takes us. We thought we'd record it and maybe share it with some other people who home ed and see if it was a technique they wanted, and also just have a bit of fun.
Yep.
So what are we talking about today?
The Invisible Man.
The Invisible Man, who was written by
H.G. Wells.
Okay.
So, who's going to begin?
You can begin. You've got the notes. I've
Okay.
only got two.
My first point is, the Invisible Man went mad in the end. And the next question is, why? And how else could his life have been? So, you know.
I'll probably give you guys a bit of context of why we're talking about H.G. Wells. A couple of years ago, we went to the British Library in London, and they had a science fiction exhibition, and we both came back and we both read H.G. Wells. And I read The Invisible Man and I read The Invaders from Mars. And do you want to talk a bit about that first?
I don't actually remember, because I only read them once and it was years ago.
Okay. So the premise is that the Invisible Man went mad and then did what?
Anything he liked.
Okay.
Good things, bad things, but just anything he wanted to do.
And it made him mad?
More like he went mad and then he did anything he wanted to do.
Okay. We're both quite sick at the moment, so if there's going to be coughing and things, we're just going to have to deal with it. So was it the invisibility that made him mad?
I don't know. In a way, but it's my idea that it wasn't the invisibility that made him mad, more the fact that, well, yeah, actually, the invisibility. Yeah, the invisibility in general.
Why would that make him mad?
I don't know.
Well, we were talking about it the other day, and we were saying that because he couldn't see himself, and he lost his idea of who he was because he couldn't see himself.
But then I came back with a really wise, creepy thing, which was, if I couldn't see myself and no one else could see me, I would define myself not by what I looked like, but by my actions.
And I also was saying into that both my grandparents were blind, and they couldn't see themselves, although they could be seen, but they couldn't see themselves, and how did they define who they were? And they defined themselves by their actions and by their feelings, I suppose. And then the question then kind of comes back down to, was he mad before he decided he wanted to be invisible? Because that's a pretty odd thing to want to be.
I don't know. Maybe he had his own reason. We don't actually, or I don't know what he was like before.
See, I have a vague recollection of the book, which I probably should have read again before doing this. But I remember one that I really didn't like, the style it was written in. It was very similar to the War of the Worlds, which again was very analytical. It was very unfeeling, and it was very odd. Especially as I've read a lot of other books from around that era and from even earlier, and that it didn't really correspond with this. It was a very new style. It was very stark. It was very sterile. So yeah, it was. The vaguest recollection of the book was that again, it was somebody else observing somebody else observing somebody else. It was very odd.
Like in the sixth person or something.
Oh yeah, almost. It was quite peculiar. What else have you got on your list?
He's invisible, but what about the food he eats?
See now,
that was the point that you came up with.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I got a book called Gargling with Jelly. It's a poetry book, and one of the poems in it is about about a guy who's invisible, and one of the lines is, everything would have been alright if everything inside had been out of sight. And it was about the fact that the food and the partially digested stuff was still floating around in midair and being really quite unpleasant. And then it comes back to, well, is he invisible? Are his cells invisible? Or is it somehow refracting the light around him?
What kind of invisibility?
Yeah, what kind of invisibility does he have? Is it in his cells? Is it in just his skin? Is it the outer layer? You know, what is invisible?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know.
What do you
I
think?
don't know a lot of things.
That's okay.
But I think that you make a good point about the food. So, I think that everything is invisible, but at the same time not, which is a very difficult thing to actually put into words, which is kind of like your idea of the refraction of light, but more like light moves through him as though he's not even there.
But there are things inside him, theoretically, like food and stuff,
that would be shadow and such.
Yeah. So if it's not a body-wide thing, it's got to be like the invisible cloak, you know, like the...
Well, it could be a body-wide thing, like it goes in the body and it's invisible.
What else is on your list?
Nothing.
No.
I was like...
The voice from behind the camera says, the process of eating mixes your own body cells with
the food.
With the food.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
I.e. saliva, enzymes,
So you think it's
bodily fluids.
So his enzymes break things down and make everything that he eats invisible. Would that be an instantaneous? So he would... Does that mean he would have invisible poop?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. What's the smell? Okay. Well, that took a turn. So, what else? What did you think? I mean, I know you say you can't remember much about the book, but
well, I didn't read that book. All I got to reading was The War of the Worlds. You were the one who read The Invisible Man book.
And what did you think?
About The War of the Worlds? All I really remember is it was very, very depressing.
It is quite depressing. It's the only word. There's two words. It was very clinical, and it was very lonely. Those are the two kind of words and things that stick in my mind.
So depressing.
I wouldn't say necessarily depressing, but what it was, I mean, it was this. I mean, we can talk about the nature of how much people put into their books, but it was this man who felt like he was almost like a brain on legs. He just didn't have a feeling. He didn't have a... And like all the women characters, right, are just rubbish. There's not any kind of empathy with any other people. In fact, there's mostly contempt for pretty much everybody else alive. It's almost sympathetic to the aliens, to the point of that there we are, over emotional, rubbishy creatures that probably don't deserve to. And we're really stupid. I mean, like, you know, there's a thing crashes and basically everybody kind of gathers around and pokes it with a stick. And I suppose it's that kind of mentality that he's sort of rebuking, I suppose. But it wasn't very it wasn't a pleasant read. It wasn't like you know. I mean, do you think that there was an anxiety of the industrialization of that age? Do you think that there was this sort of... Well, it's a question. Do you think there was some kind of anxiety about the industrial nature at that age, about what was clinical, about what was nature, what it meant to be alive? What do you think?
It's entirely possible that there was, in fact, an anxiety. Unfortunately, H.G. Wells is, according to popular theory, either somewhere in the time stream or dead. Either way, we cannot really ask him.
So what did this conversation make you think about?
Well, the last time we had the conversation, I ended up thinking about cake, but this time, what?
Go on.
But this time it's more... I'm more thinking about why. Why were people so afraid of nature, or the industrialization of nature, or why were they so upset about whether or not they were alive?
Well, I think it comes down to that era of history had a huge amount of industrialization. You're talking about the Victorian age, you're talking about coming towards the end of that, towards Edwardian. I think that's about the right time thing. I'd have to double check. But the general gist of the timing of it is that they've had this massive industrial upheaval, and everything has gone from getting up when it's light to having artificial light everywhere, to having these huge machines doing these huge jobs, and people being cogs in a wheel of commerce and industry and manufacturing, and people being really seen as
Parts
in a machine. And there was a great and you had this idea that there were people who could think, who were intellectual, and there were people who could do, and there wasn't
people who do both.
No, and there was this idea that, and they still had this, it's quite a misogynistic book in lots of ways. I mean, the only thing I can remember about the women in the thing was that a couple of women fainted. And you're like, okay. Now bear in mind that a lot of other books, Moll Flanders wouldn't have fainted. Mind you saying that Moll Flanders has probably been poking it with a stick. It was very anti-nature, lots of things I suppose, but it was this idea that somehow we were machines, and we were pretty crap machines at that.
The voice behind the camera wishes to interject at this point.
Go on.
If you're looking at the War of the Worlds,
yeah,
it is nature that saves the day. It is nature, the smallest things, the things that most people would see as inconsequential, are the things that actually save us.
Well, you have to also understand that germs and understanding of microbial life is a very new thing in that era. They've only just sort of really developed the microscope. Their only belief in germs and the sort of the microorganisms is still not widespread. And maybe really it was a sort of way of being able to promote that scientific idea, because there were plenty of doctors who didn't even believe in germs in the Victorian era. They weren't considered to be fact. And things like cholera and all sorts of other diseases. It's the beginning place of a lot of things, but it's a place of anxiety. There's a huge anxiety about how much they don't know, I suppose, and
fear of the unknown.
Yeah, there is this sort of I'm trying to think what I don't know. It went. There was a thought. It went.
Oh. Oh well.
So while maybe nature does save the day, it doesn't really. Again, it doesn't really have much of a. From what I read, it doesn't seem to have a very high perspective of people. The layman, the poor peasants are not considered to be. They're barely considered people at all. Then the clergy are frightened people terrorised by the modern world, and women are just things. And it was. I think that for me was quite depressing.
I told you.
Depressing. Okay. So yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
Why did H.G. Wells write in this way at that particular time? What is your theory?
What is my theory? I think he was writing for a very specific intellectual audience, and I think that he wanted to have his work respected and his ideas respected. And it was far more about getting the ideas and the narrative down than about exploring characters or anything like that. He didn't really. It was almost an essay with a story attached to it about, you know, I don't know, people being rubbish and the sort of the unworthiness of humanity to inherit the earth.
The voice behind the camera says this: remember, many characters in the War of the Worlds do not have a name, only a title related to their job.
Yeah.
The newspaperman, the clergyman, the artilleryman. Having said that, the clergyman is named, but by his wife, whose name I can't remember.
She may not even have had her name mentioned. She does, but it is quite. I don't know. I'm trying to find the right words. Whilst a narrative is a good narrative, I think that there are an infinite number of ways that it could have. And it almost sets the entire tone of the genre, of science fiction genre, which is quite stark, bold ideas, less characterization, and the sort of a male-centric viewpoint. And I love science fiction, but I mean, you know, when we get to sort of Asimov and stuff like that, that's just, oh god, awful, badly written.
Didn't you spend like 2 months and you only made it halfway through a book this thick?
I know. I mean, that's like not like me. I can motor through. I couldn't. I managed to finish it in the end, but I absolutely detested it. It wasn't Hyperion. I love Hyperion. That was an amazing, although quite frustrating book. And it certainly wasn't a Frank Herbert. The problem with a lot of the science fiction is this very male-centric, sterile point of view. And the lack of characterization, especially in the early field, and women as an afterthought or as a decoration, and it's such a shame to. I think, you know, I love science fiction and I love science fantasy. And one of the things that I prefer about, I mean, you do get misogynistic sort of fantasy work, especially high fantasy stuff. But in general, the women and the characterization of fantasy stuff tends to be much better fleshed out. They tend to be whole people, whereas in a lot of science fiction, they're kind of ideas or jobs with walking around. It's almost Brechtian the way that they're just sort of walking around. I am the newspaper man. Nearly at time. We only filmed for like 18 minutes because that's how long the code lasts for. Anything else you want to say?
Like and subscribe.
Good job. Are we going to high five you? And then I coughed.
Bye bye.